This is the WatchGeekTime podcast.
Good afternoon and welcome to WatchGeekTime. This is the WatchGeekTime podcast. It's a conversation about heritage, history, and why we're so hooked on horology. Sit back, relax. We're going to talk about everything from watches to watches. The WatchGeekTime podcast is recorded live on Saturdays from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. Pacific time. Also streamed live at WatchGeekTime.com and on Apple TV. I am your host and resident watch geek, Scott Goldman. On the boards, as always, is...
It's Jody. Hi there, Scott.
Hello, Jody. I haven't seen you for a couple weeks, my friend.
I know I've been a busy man, but I tell you what, I was in Vegas just on the weekend, actually.
Do tell about the Mecca of Vegas.
I was there with my brother-in-law, and we ended up going down to Caesars in the shopping mall there that they've got. But
you mean the market, the shopping,
the whole walk, that mile walk?
Oh, yeah. Good God, yeah, okay.
And I noticed
Forum shops.
That's right, the Forum. Jaeger, I noticed they had a brand new store there, and it was beautiful. Beautiful store. I couldn't resist it, so I had to go in there and have a look. It was wonderful. So
there's also a Tourneau there.
The Turner. I've been there a few times in the past, but that's upsetting going in there. I have to walk out. It's like
I think it's like 5 stories in that place.
Yeah. So it's well worth going there. There's so many boutique stores there. It's wonderful.
Well, it's interesting. I haven't seen that new Jaeger boutique there at the Forum shops yet. They were still building it when I was there last time.
Right.
I know that they've got like Joe's Crab at one end and the Tourneau at the other.
Right.
That's how I read. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's good to be back. It's been a couple weeks. So for all you binge listeners, welcome to a fresh episode of WatchGeekTime.com. All right, so a little talk about our watches today. Jody, what you got there?
I brought I've got the Omega Seamaster 300.
Omega.
It's nice. It's got the black face here, but
it is nice.
The thing that really gets me is how they did the second hand, and it's in the black and yellow striping. Typical of the marine world. But it's great. It's a beautiful piece. But one of the things I like about the back is it
see-through there?
It is
very nice.
It's got the machining. Is that what did you say it was?
It's the Geneva stripes. Very nice, yes.
And
that one also has the George Daniels coaxial escapement in it, so it's not the traditional Swiss lever. It's got almost like a 4-finger effect.
Okay.
Which we've talked about. Yeah, that one's really nice, though.
It is nice. So,
where'd you get that, Jody? Did you sell another sponsor or something?
No, I had to sell a car for this.
Oh,
but it's a great watch.
What do you think about this one? This is my Aquastar Regate.
That is something I've never seen.
And this one's got the 5 moons. And if you press this button, the moons fill in blue, and then the second hand turns around here, and they go from blue to red. There's 5 moons. They go from blue to red, and that's the 2 heats of the yacht race.
Right.
Although it appears, though, this one needs some service.
Okay.
I got to say. Got it from a trusted seller on Chrono24 who might not be so trusted, but I'm happy with it. It's something I've hunted for a long time.
Yeah, it's great.
I like it. Great. Sadly, my Amvox has gone back to the spa yet again. That's my favorite watch. We haven't even talked about it on the show. I don't think I've even had it for a day. But we got a lot to get to today, and our watch geek term from 2 weeks ago was rattrapant. Rattrapant, which is a type of chronograph, which we will talk about. But before we get to that, we're going to cover our brands, which this week will be Blancpain and Eberhard. Before we talk about brands, we do the email thing. So, Jody, without further ado.
All right, let me pull it up here. We've got Boris Spector from Moscow, Russia, writes in.
Boris, wait a minute. Boris Spector from Moscow?
It's Boris.
Boris. Okay.
And
his wife, Natasha.
And he's saying, I have a Rolex Datejust. I was traveling and set the time for the place where I was. Now I'm back in St. Petersburg and my watch is doing funny stuff. The watch thinks that it's the previous day. The date changes at 12 noon, not midnight. I'm afraid to do any adjustments because I don't want to screw up the movement. Please help me fix the day-night cycle for my Datejust.
Boris. Okay. Here's the deal. You really never want to adjust a watch like this backwards. So you only need to go forwards. And what you're going to have to do is what you'll do is you'll pull the crown out 2 positions, what we call the second position. And the second hand will stop because the Rolex has what's called a hack mechanism. And you will adjust the watch forward another 12 hours to force the date to change. And that, of course, will be to tomorrow. And then you will move the date to 6 a.m. So you'll stop. You'll know you're in the day mode of the watch. And then you can push the crown all the way back in. The second hand will start again.
Right.
Now you want to pull the crown out to the first position, also known as the quick set position. And if you turn... And this is on a day date, by the way. If you turn the crown forward, you will be changing the date of the watch at 3 o'clock. And if you turn the crown towards you, or what we call counterclockwise, you will be changing the day of the week display at 12.
Right.
Once you've got those both set the way you want, pull the crown all the way out and set it to the right time. So if it's past noon, say 3 p.m., because right now the watch is at 6 a.m., turn the watch all the way past 12 to 3 p.m., and at this point, you should be good as new. You should always set the hands moving forward, okay? So this will make sure that your date is changing at midnight and not at lunchtime.
Right. Yeah.
All right? That makes sense. Did you have any questions on that?
I don't. Maybe he needs a good traveling watch.
I think he
24 hours.
I think he needs a world time watch.
A world time.
Because if he wants to call his friends in another country, that'll help him out too.
Yeah.
All right, Boris. I hope that helped you out.
So we've got Cameron Rohan from Fairbanks, Alaska, writes in, and he's asking, some days it can be warm enough to thaw out the ice on the ground. The next day it could be cold enough to burn the skin off your face.
Oh.
Can you recommend a watch for someone that lives in a drastic and constantly changing climate? Which is interesting, actually, if you're in, such cold climates with mechanical metal, watches. That's a good question.
Well, it's a great question, and it actually goes back to something we've talked about in the past, which is isochronism.
Right.
And if you think about it, when I look at the weather map, I noticed it's about 55 degrees in Fairbanks today. That's Fahrenheit. But, Fairbanks, Alaska is more about the middle of the state of Alaska, so at least they have a more normal kind of daylight. And there are places in our 49th state that are just plain dark 6 months out of the year, like Barrow, Alaska.
That's where you need your illuminescence.
Well, that's where you have to have the luminescence, but I think we digress. If I lived in such an extreme climate, depending on my budget, I'm probably going to go with an ultra trustworthy tool type watch like a Rolex or even a Casio G-Shock, but even that one needs some sunlight. Right? The Zenith Stratos proved itself uber extreme as it survived the blood-boiling conditions of space. attached to Felix Baumgartner's suit as he fell to earth at a speed exceeding 830 miles per hour. I don't think you need that extreme a watch.
I think it's proven itself.
It has. Some say Bremont's U2 watch is the top gunner with the case that's hardened to 2,000 Vickers, which sounds very hard. And the Ulysses Nardin Maxi divers with the vulcanized rubber cases seem to be incredibly durable. I'm sorry, what was the question again?
I think he's recommending a watch for someone who lives in such a dynamic environment. Yeah, the cold climate.
He's got to have a Rolex.
Good old faithful.
He's got to have a Rolex. Hey, if you have a question or comment, go ahead and email us, scott@watchgeektime.com. Tweet us on the tweet us on the Twigger, at WatchGeekTime. Instagram, WatchGeekTime Pics, that's Pix. It's also at WatchGeekTime.com. Pictures of everything we talk about on the show. Boy, all this social media, shameless self-promotion, yeah.
It's great.
It's fun.
It's good.
All right, so I think we're going to go ahead and talk about one of the world's great Swiss brands at this point, Blancpain, as well as another Swiss favorite, Eberhard.
It's Blancpain.
Blancpain. It's actually Blancpain. Blancpain. The company's motto, committed to the tradition of mechanical watchmaking since 1735. Blancpain also likes to boast that it has never made a quartz watch. Now, actually, founded in 1735 by Jérôme Jacques Blancpain in Villeret, Switzerland, it's one of the oldest known of all the Swiss brands, and like many of the original Swiss watchmakers, or as the OG, as you know I like to call them, the originals, the OG. Their workshops were located in the Jura Mountains and generally in their homes.
Right.
And it was actually in 1815, the great-grandson of the founder, we've heard about this nepotism so many times, Frederick Louis Blancpain, who not only modernized a number of the factory's production methods, he completely transformed the entire workshop into an industrial-driven producer of watch movements.
Now, we're talking 1815, so this is before electricity.
Just before, really. I mean, there was electricity, but it wasn't in huge availability. And at the same time, what was interesting is not the Swiss who were famous for watches. It was the Americans who were bringing some very competitive timepieces at some very competitive price points. So in 1865, Blancpain built a large factory next to the River Suze. And they did this so they could make use of the water power to supply the electricity
Right, there we go.
needed for its modernized production. And for this reason, Blancpain is one of the very few firms to survive Villeret, because it came under attack in World War I, World War II, and we've heard of many watch firms going under as a course of the war. In 1932, a very strange thing happened. Frederick Emile's only daughter, Berthe Blancpain, didn't want anything to do with watchmaking. So two members of the Blancpain staff who were very close to Frederick bought Blancpain.
Sorry, Scott, I've got to do this.
Oh, all right. We're going to be right back. We'll finish the tradition of Blancpain. This is the Watch Geek Time, the Watch Geek Time podcast. We'll be right back after these messages. It's the only way Jody can afford a Seamaster, thank goodness.
There are movements Omega coaxial, the most perfect mechanical watch movement in the world.
And now, here's the Watch Geek, Scott Goldman.
Thank you, David. Good to be back with you. It's the Watch Geek Time podcast, a conversation about heritage, history, and why we're all so hooked on horology. I am your host and resident watch geek, Scott Goldman. As always, with me is...
It's Jody.
Jody, when we were interrupted by your pot pushing...
Sorry about that.
Well, listen, it just turned out to be an Omega commercial.
Isn't it wonderful?
What a coincidence. Shocker. We're going to have a discussion about that. Fredo. In 1932, a very strange thing happened. Frederick Emile's only daughter, remember, Frederick Emile was the great-grandson of Jacques Blancpain. So Frederick Emile Blancpain's daughter, Berthe Blancpain, didn't want anything to do with watchmaking.
That's a problem.
It's weird. First time that's really happened anywhere, really, because as the stories we've been reading about week after week, it's always nepotism. So two members of the Blancpain staff who were very close to Frederick bought Blancpain, and as was the tradition at the time, they actually changed the name to Rayville.
It's Raville.
Raville. I'm not sure exactly the pronunciation, but it had to do something with the mashing up of two names.
Right, Reville.
And it actually was Reville, formerly Blancpain, which was sort of like the way that it read on things. So movements actually are stamped that way. The inside of cases say Reville... ACCC ... Blancpain. It's really kind of a cool thing to see. And actually, in the 1950s, the name of the company was officially changed to Raville Blancpain. So if you've got one of these watches that has Rayville Blancpain printed on the dial, you got some cool provenance. That watch got some stories. Right. Now, in 1992, SSIH, or what is now known as the Swatch Group, purchased Blancpain for 60 million Swiss francs. And we all know that the famous watch gregarian Jean-Claude Biver of Hublot fame, he remained as the head of this great brand, and he's also credited with resurrecting Blancpain to its original greatness. And again, one of the things I like to talk about is how they never, ever made a quartz watch when all the other Swiss firms practically did.
Everyone had to swing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And of course, Jean-Claude Biver left, and it's now in the hands of the youngest of the Hayeks, Nicholas Hayek. His picture... You'll see it on the website, WatchGeekTime.com, or of course on Instagram, which is WatchGeekTime Pics, PIX. He looks like a gangster. I'll show you the.
I haven't seen that picture yet.
The guy looks like a gangster. It's a little bit frightening. Anyways, he's now the head of Blancpain, as he is also the head of Breguet. And you know, it's interesting, because one thing that Blancpain can claim, which a lot of other large firms cannot claim, is that each watch is made by a single watchmaker, which is also kind of neat.
Are they signed?
I believe they're signed. In some way, it says this watcher constructed this watch.
Okay.
Yeah, which in this day and age is definitely unusual. It's very strange. Right. It's a little bespoke. Blancpain is probably best known for its 50 Fathoms watch, which was launched in 1953, produced at the request of the French Navy. And essentially, they are France's Navy SEALs. They needed a reliable watch for their underwater operations. It was also the watch worn by Jacques Cousteau.
There you go.
So the 50 Fathoms became the standard reference among diving watches. The Blancpain 50 Fathoms, along with the Rolex Submariner, has been selected by the United States Navy as the preferred mariner's timepiece.
Sorry, Scott. I've got to do this.
I don't care. It's the Watch Geek Time podcast. We'll be right back after these messages, and we're going to talk a little bit about Eberhard & Co. Stick around. We'll be right back.
When you wrestle a gorilla, you don't stop when you're tired. You stop when the gorilla's tired. That's why, if you have a prang and your wheels just aren't turning, the good folks at More Than could send you a courtesy car within 2 hours. To find out more, visit morethan.com. I'm More Than Freeman. Thank you for listening.
Excludes Northern Ireland. Offer may be withdrawn at any time. Terms and conditions apply. Comprehensive cover only using our recommended repairers.
There is a watchmaking standard that is revered around the world. That standard comes from Rolex. From clasp to bracelet to its unique watertight oyster case, a Rolex holds its value because it was intended to. Crafted from just 3 precious metals, platinum, steel, and gold, each defies the ordinary. Its steel, 904L, virtually indestructible and corrosion resistant, is incomparable. Its patented Ever Rose Gold, created in an exclusive foundry, will remain beautiful for life. Inside, a genuine Rolex movement is a product of superiority and remarkable testing. It is unrivaled. At Rolex, flawless standards create more than a watch. They create a value that was meant to endure. For a complete selection of Rolex timepieces, visit your official Rolex jeweler.
Available at Lux, Bond, and Green Jewelers, Westport, Greenwich, and other locations throughout Connecticut and Massachusetts, where every box has a story.
This is the Watch Geek Time podcast.
Welcome back to Watch Geek Time. I am your host, Scott Goldman. I am your Watch Geek, and I am accompanied by...
It's Jody.
Jody, you got us so quickly to commercial. I just wanted to make just one more Blancpain point. May I?
Bring it on.
You know, the Blancpain 50 Fathoms is such an important watch that I didn't know if I got to mention it was a Jacques Cousteau watch, but if you can find one of these watches anywhere, they're worth a lot of dough. Like if it's from the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, it's huge bucks. Right. Okay, so anyways, just wanted to make sure that people listening know that if you happen to find a Blancpain of your grandpa's in a box, and it's got a little, you'll see it on WatchGeekTime.com. It's got that little sort of nuclear symbol on the dial.
Yeah.
It's worth money.
Right.
Yeah. So, the next brand we're going to talk about is Eberhard. Joe, can I ask you to just grab my glasses over there?
Sure. Let me get this for you.
As you get to be my age, folks, you need glasses. Sometimes you set them down during the break. Oh, thank you. Now I can see things. Welcome to the back to the Watch Geek Time podcast. You'll see pictures of everything at Instagram, and that's Watch Geek Time Pics, P-I-X. And of course, on the Twitter at WatchGeekTime, WatchGeekTime.com. Eberhard. You know, Jody, I could not find a slogan or a catchphrase or a company tagline for Eberhard, but I do know that George, and notice George doesn't have this like hyphenated name. He founded his company in Le Chaux de Fonds, And it's actually one of the most historic places in all of Switzerland, Le Chaux de Fonds. They consider it the birthplace of watchmaking, actually. Okay. And George Eberhard was the son of a prominent Bernese family that traces its origins all the way back to the 10th century. So you can really almost understand that the Eberhard family was one of those founding families of Switzerland and the canton that they were in. And it was his father who was into watchmaking at first and initiated him to that art of watchmaking. Eberhard was only 22 when he would found his company. So in 1907, the company became one of the largest Swiss watch manufacturers and inaugurated its new headquarters, which took an entire block on the Rue Léopold Robert in Le Chaux de Fonds. And
it was well said then.
Thank you. I've been working on my French. Yeah. You know, it was interesting as we were talking during the break about how the Parisian lifestyle had come to really infiltrate parts of this area with their Beaux art style, that round tower topped by that darkish kind of bird, I guess, eagle-like sculpture.
Yeah.
And it's become one of the city's well-known landmarks. Its highest construction until the 1960s. And now the city is booming. I mean, if you've been to Le Chaux de Fonds, it's where the great museum is. Hey, I'm going to put some pictures that I took at Le Chaux de Fonds. I've got great watchmaker Martin Braun standing in front of a clock. That you can't believe. It's crazy. Yeah, I'm going to put that up on the website.
Great.
All right. 1947, at the end of the World War II, the manufacturer started back up. I didn't mention it. It did shut down during World War II. And the company was shut down. It resumed its activities right after World War II, and it started making its first women's watch and jewelry collections. At present, since about 1995, 96, I guess, the manufacturer has decided to focus on luxury king-size wrist watches. Those of us who are watch geeks like Jody and I, we notice that a lot of their watches tend to look like the dashboards of automobiles.
Right.
High-end chronographs, 8-day manual wound mechanical watches. 8-day means that it needs to be wound a week and a day.
Right.
So usually they have a power reserve on the dial somewhere. And it's interesting because they own, they're very characteristic because they have all of their sub-dials in a row.
Right.
So if you're looking at a chronograph, a standard chronograph, you generally have the counters for minutes and hours at 3 or 9 respectively, but they have all of them 1, 2, 3, 4 right across. And again, you could see pictures of an Eberhard at Instagram or on WatchGeekTime.com. So, at the break, Jody and I were talking some dear history about a guy named John Harrison. Jody, why don't you tell us why did the conversation come up?
Well, we were talking about the, I guess, watches through the whole evolution of watches right from the beginning and the necessities and changes in engineering and the problems they occurred that we were talking about ship's clocks.
Yeah.
And obviously, the use of a pendulum out at sea is useless.
You can't use a pendulum at sea.
Yeah. Correct. So due to that, there's been some innovative engineering come out of that.
Right, and we were talking about John Harrison, whose legacy is that he essentially created the first clock that worked out on the ocean.
That's right. And
it was, why was that so, that was kind of important because latitude is easy, right? What's the problem? The problem is longitude.
The longitude. So that's disastrous, and it has been.
Right. You coming from down under.
Exactly.
One thing that you were talking about how it affected you.
Yeah. Exactly. It's, I mean, traveling, the first time I went to the Northern Hemisphere, just being used to be, I was able to navigate. I could work out where north, south, west was.
Right.
It threw me out, and it took me a long time to get used to where north, east, where south was.
Sure. And when did you notice that the toilets flush in the opposite direction?
I knew that straight away.
Oh, okay,
That was,
good. So I just had to know.
And we were talking about the Industrial Revolution and how
Well, we were talking about the trade revolution, actually.
the trade revolution.
When ships were... The problem was ships were a quarter mile from port and smashing into a rock, and all lives lost, everybody done,
And-
all the cargo.
Yeah. And there was great innovations to, there were great rewards actually to have as something like a watch, some sort of mechanical, reliable device that could, counteract that.
Well, it's interesting because... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, you're right. So,
it's interesting that Harrison, who was, I think, probably mostly driven by some greedy tendency,
right.
he was more interested in trying to figure out, not because he wanted to save the world somehow, but he wanted, what was it, like 20,000 pounds?
And this is what,
50,
something like that.
So that's like a gajillion pounds.
Right. And he was a cabinet maker?
Yeah, he was like a carpenter, but he was a clockmaker too.
Yeah.
But he was convinced like he could take his mechanisms, and actually he was a pretty clever guy because he's got some other papers that he wrote involving something called a grasshopper escapement. I think he was the first guy actually to put two pendulums in resonance, actually. Maybe he didn't figure it out, but I think to something we've talked about on a past show. And then
he was leaning into that.
He was going that way. You could see, and he was all about accuracy.
Yeah.
He was really driven by making watches that lost almost no time over the course of a month, and he was convinced he could do it.
Yeah.
So when we were looking at that marine chronometer, H1, H2, H3, would not be John Harrison who would realize this beautiful, wondrous leap in timekeeping accuracy. It would be his son. Again, there's the nepotism.
And for the listeners, the thing that got me was on his third one. It took him 17 years just on the third, prototype that he was working on.
There you go.
17 years.
So how old must he have been?
Exactly. It's crazy.
Right. So he was at this time not only taking notes that I'm understanding weren't so meticulous, but he was also training his son how to carry on his legacy.
Yeah.
It's astounding stuff. And he did solve the problem because, as you and I know, at the same time, there's guys lying on their backs, staring up in the sky through telescopes, mapping the stars, and that's all great, and sextants and using that tool is fantastic. But what happens when you're at sea and there's nothing but clouds in the sky for 3, 4, 5 weeks?
Right. Exactly. You've got problems.
Big
problems.
You got problems. So when we talk about these incredible leaps in timekeeping, guys like Harrison did outstanding stuff. And certainly from the standpoint of then realizing that he really needed to take the clock and turn it into just a big watch. Because remember, the idea was a clock had a pendulum.
Yeah.
And a watch had a balance spring or a balance wheel with a spring.
Yeah.
And he really realized that he needed to make a clock with it was that other guy, George, what was it? Forget it. It was like George somebody who he was like almost there.
Yeah.
But some guys got so married to the whole, hey, it has to be done this way and you can't do it that way.
And they were using pendulums. They were sticking with the pendulum idea.
And they didn't understand that the pendulum would never work that way.
Right.
And, of course, they were also starting to see that there were other issues affecting isochronism.
Yeah.
Like the hot and cold days on the sea, or the wetness or the dryness, the arid, the humid.
The acidity.
Perfect.
Yeah,
All
salt.
the salt in the air, the pressure in the air, everything that you could possibly experience when you're out on the sea.
Yeah.
So it really became a serious race to see who could figure it all out.
Yeah.
And Harrison did. Obviously, his legacy is his legacy. I invite everybody to read the book Longitude. Available on Amazon.com. I'm a Prime member. Are you?
So our very wristwatches that we have now are derived due to engineering, due to the sea.
You know,
necessities from that.
in some cases, yes. You know, if you were to look at some of the watches, like you've looked at the Romain Gaultier Logical one, it's got a Fusi chain.
Yeah.
So the Fusi chain is an example of the marine chronometer. Uses a Fusi chain system, so you have that constant force across all 8 days. One thing that's interesting, a cool factoid about the marine chronometer, there was only one guy, I think beyond the ship's captain, there was one other guy who had a key to get into the closet where they kept the clock. And there was, if you were a guy in there and you decided to go in there and F with the clock for whatever reason, and they caught you, they threw your ass over the side of the ship.
Right.
Because they became so reliant on the ship's clock that was the only way you could really know where you were, north or south. Yeah. Absolutely.
It's life and death.
It's life and death for a whole crew and all that cargo. And if you noticed, one of the things that is in that whole thing, in that story that we were looking at during the break, the ship's clock never really leaves the ship. The first mate generally had another clock he wore around his neck. And he would, when they docked somewhere, he would go and set his clock to that clock that was at that port. And if he had to make an adjustment to the ship's clock, he then adjusted it to the clock that hung around his neck.
So they would reference from the port they were at.
And those clocks were built, the clock that hung around his neck, or he sometimes wore it on his wrist, but it was very large.
Yes.
That was designed and built to run as a mimic of the ship's clock.
The master.
Yeah, so
clock.
so they realized they needed redundancy even back then.
Right.
And it's 90?
Yeah.
Right at the turn of the Industrial Revolution, which is why it was so important, because then shipping really took off, and so did railroad transport.
Steam. Yeah, the steam industry was huge.
It was huge. And now Breguet figures out how to do the tourbillon, because you got this conductor on a train that's constantly checking his watch, and you've got the guy down the lane, down the tracks, who's constantly checking his watch because he's supposed to pull the lever at the exact right moment, so the train goes that way and not this way.
Yeah.
And unless they both have watches that no matter what, and I mean pocket watches now, right?
Yeah.
Imagine a pocket watch. Then that's a problem. That's a big problem, because everybody's watch is drifting in a different manner.
Yeah.
So, anyways, different things came along and were very inventive. You know, we think about guys like Harrison. We have to talk about guys like Breguet, Perrellet, Edison, Eiffel, the Otis brothers. Yeah. And I don't mean Otis Redding. I mean like the guys that figured out how to put elevators in the Eiffel Tower.
Yeah.
So ingenuity has always played these amazing leapfrogging sort of ways throughout the ages, especially in timekeeping. And it's interesting to me because when anybody says, no, you can't do it that way, you know you're doing it the right way.
Right.
Yeah. So anyways, guys like Breguet, his name's on the side of the Eiffel Tower. Edison and Eiffel were best buddies.
Yeah.
That's not by accident.
Yeah.
That's not by accident either, Jody.
Sorry, Scott. I've got to do this.
It's a conversation about heritage, history, and of course, horology. It's the WatchGeekTime.com podcast. We're going to step aside so that I can pay for my Aquastar, which looks like it needs repair. And Jody can pay for that Omega Seamaster 300. We'll be right back after these words.
A hungry bird said to a crocodile, "Can I have those bits of meat stuck between your teeth?" "Dive in," said the crocodile. "I've had a good nosh." Next day, the grateful bird brought all his mates, and from then on, the birds were never hungry, and the crocodiles never had to fork out for a hygienist. And the moral is, goodwill spread around gets around. This story was brought to you by ING Direct, 92% of whose mortgage customers would recommend them to a friend. ING Direct, a decent way to do banking. Visit ingdirect.co.uk.
UK residents 18 plus, 50,000 to £1 million subject to status. 92% based on ING Direct customer satisfaction survey, April 2011.
Sometimes you get more done without a boss. Not that leadership isn't valuable. It's just that when you don't have anyone looking over your shoulder, you often come up with better stuff. At Honda, we run our research and development team as a separate company, giving them room to mess around, doodle, try, fail, try again, and eventually come up with something that surprises them as much as it surprises us. Do you believe in the power of dreams?
Rolex, Patek Philippe, Jaeger-LeCoultre, Omega, Cartier, Breguet, and just about any other watch brands that come to mind. This is the Watch Geek Time podcast.
It's the time of the season when love runs high. In this time, give it to me easy.
Oh, Jojo, give it to me easy.
Oh, well.
So, as we do, we talk about, a geeky word every show. And as we mentioned 2 weeks ago, when we met last, the word was Rattrapante.
Yeah, Rattrapante.
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 Rattrapante. Now, a rattrapante is a chronograph that has two hands. Not just one, but two. Unlike a standard chronograph, because that allows it to time two simultaneous events. So, for instance, in a rattrapante, you start the first hand. So you got a horse coming out of the gate, or a race car coming around the track, whichever, and you hit the first button, which starts the first chronograph hand.
Right.
And then you want to know what the time of the horse was at the quarter mile. So when the horse reaches the quarter mile, you hit another button, which then stops that hand, but the hand that was underneath it that you didn't see.
So they'll simultaneously be going together.
When you started off the rattrapante,
yeah,
chronograph, both hands were traveling in tandem. You just didn't see the one on the bottom.
Right.
And the guy who figured this all out is a guy like Rusek. And Montblanc did a nice job of doing a tribute. But essentially, he had a machine that used a little ink pen that would make a little mark when you'd hit the button on this box. So you'd hit the button to start it, and the chronograph hand would start turning.
Yeah.
And then when you wanted to mark a quarter mile or a half mile, you'd hit this button, and an ink pen, a fountain pen obviously, would mark the disc where you hit the button.
Yeah. And you'd work out that quarter mile from there.
And then you'd know, and the stopwatch didn't stop.
Yeah.
Another hand kept going. So that's a rattrapante, and we call those split times. That way you can figure out split times. There's also a good way, I guess it's a French word, right? For take again, or rattrapante.
Rattrapante.
Sometimes called a flyback also. Yeah. So anyways, this week's word was rattrapante.
So what's next week's word?
Well, we really didn't get into that. We kind of wanted to hear from you, the viewers. And I think I think somebody was asking me specifically this week, what's coaxial escapement? And since you're wearing one, I think we'll wait till next week. We'll talk about the great George Daniels.
That'd be great. Yeah.
Who, if you think about it, is just like a Breguet or even a Parallel, who came up with the automatic winder.
Yeah.
Or even a Harrison. So all these guys made some pretty incredible leaps in their fields throughout the years.
Yeah.
Pretty amazing stuff. The story goes, Parallel is the one who invented the automatic winder, but he took it to Breguet because he couldn't get it to work.
Really?
Right. So when you look at this craft of hundreds of years, it is quite astounding when you think how the tradition has been approached in each, I guess, generation or two, somebody's made a huge leap or a huge bound.
Yeah.
So that said, George Daniels and the coaxial we'll discuss next week. And, we also have talked about F.P. Journe.
Yeah.
And his huge leaps forward. So I think we'll just talk about inspirational independent watchmakers in general. Maybe we'll touch upon like a Ludovic Balleward and his Upside Down or his Halftime.
Yeah.
Oh, they're just gorgeous. Or maybe we'll look at the Breguet hands or Kari Voutilainen's interpretation of the Breguet hands.
Yeah.
Which
That'd
I think
great.
is also very interesting. But we'll get into that. Into that subtle stuff. By the way, a great watch resource to check out is, of course, WatchGeekTime.com, but I also encourage you to check out the glossary at WatchTime.com. Next week's WGT guests will include Gary Vedetta, who's going to tell us about all the new offerings from Element in Time. And I know we keep talking about it, but we're going to get Leo Gwynn in here from the Jaja Le Culture Boutique in Beverly Hills. He's been very busy. Apparently, Cartier has taken over all of Brighton, which is what we used to call Richmond Row.
Right.
Now it's just going to be called Cartier Row. So anyways, I like to extend a special thanks to my announcer, David, and a shout out to our Watch Geek Time guy, Sergey. He's been hitting the web hard and posting some beautiful shots. And of course, as always, thanks to my Watch Geek wingman, Jody.
You're welcome. Thank
Made
you.
the trip all the way from my house today. How do you like that perpetual platinum there, baby?
Oh, it's beautiful.
Hey, it's a conversation about heritage, history, and why we're also hooked on platinum 8-day perpetual calendars. It's the WatchGeekTime.com podcast. Have a beautiful week, everybody. We'll see ya. Bye-bye.